Hello YouTube. In the long years since the release of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the Thalmor, the rulers of the Altmer Dominion, despite never being the primary antagonists of any of the games, have been building up in the background of the games and the later spin-offs to be an overarching enemy, likely for the Elder Scrolls 6. But what is life actually like in a Thalmor-ruled Altmer Dominion, so Somerset Isles and Valenwood? Are the Thalmor as bad as many people claim? Do they really run a sort of police state in this medieval fantasy-like world? We'll talk about all of that and more after the intro. So, the Thalmor, the Elven supremacist faction that has ruled the Somerset Isles since the start of the Fourth Era, after overthrowing the imperially sympathetic noble houses that used to rule the Somerset Isles in the Third Era and at the start of the Fourth Era. They believe that the Elves of Tamriel, specifically the High Elves or the Altmer, are inherently superior to the human races of the continent and the beast races of the continent. Now, as such, because those are their beliefs, they have often maintained a very pro-elf and anti-human foreign policy since their coming to power, with the biggest example being their attempt to outright destroy the human-ruled Cyrodiilic Empire during the Great War, in an attempt to return to an elven-dominated and ruled Tamriel, because that's their end goal, it seems. But what is life actually like under their rule for both High Elves and other races? That's a topic that we actually didn't know all that much about, but in the years since Skyrim we definitely learned a little bit more, both through now either defunct or almost defunct mobile spin-offs, and even through the second volume of the official Elder Scrolls cookbook of all things, which is canon as it's been completely greenlit and vetted by Bethesda, and at least the second volume literally has lore for every dish and explores much of Tamriel throughout the Fourth Era in a sort of culinary journey, ironically making it an excellent source to learn about other places on Tamriel during the Fourth Era and around the time of Skyrim. For example, we learn from the cookbook that by the Fourth Era and around and a bit before the time of Skyrim, the quality of life on the Somerset Isles seems to have taken a bit of a hit. We learned, for example, that after the Great War there were a lot of orphans on the Somerset Isles, as many military and working age High Elves died in the Great War, which to me was really eye-opening. You see, the Thalmor that we speak to in the games always try to present themselves as perfect, far superior to the measly humans and their empire with its struggles, but behind the scenes it seems to be not going quite as well as the Thalmor would like, as after the Great War the Somerset Isles had apparently lost a large part of its workforce and military. We even find evidence of this in Skyrim, where Thalmor orders that one of their agents is carrying that we can fight in the game, mentions that the Thalmor embassy has a shortage of agents and is already spread thin across different missions, despite their attempts to project outward strength and infallibility to Skyrim's population. In fact, in order to truly understand the current situation in the Somerset Isles and why it seems that things are not going quite as well as the Thalmor had planned, we need to take a look at the Thalmor when they first got to power and how life first changed under their rule and what they did inside the Somerset Isles when they came to power. Because something really strange seems to be going on in the present day. You see, Thalmor policy is that generally it seems that they closed up the Somerset Isles, so the lands of the Altmer, to all foreigners. But for the first time in apparently a long time in the years before Skyrim, they reopened the gates. People are able to visit the Somerset Isles again. Now, to understand why this is so significant, we need to take a bit of a look into the past. You see, when the Thalmor first came to power in the first 20 years of the Fourth Era, their rise from an obscure and extremist faction in Somerset politics to the eventual rulers of the Isles was slow but steady. You see, after the end of the Oblivion Crisis, they claimed that it was them, using mysterious magical forces, who ended the Oblivion Crisis, and not Martin Zeptin. They did this quickly before any news from Cyrodiil could reach the Somerset Isles. And after this, they started using the already existing anti-imperial sentiment among much of the population of the Somerset Isles to gain more and more influence on the population. You see, for centuries, the Somerset Isles had been ruled by its own nobility. You know, the kings and queens of all their own kingdoms, who over the years seemingly profited massively from being in the Empire's economic zone and tolerated imperial rule without much protest, at least after their conquest by Tiberius Septim. However, this nobility started to lose more and more influence over the population during the Thalmor's steady rise to power. You see, even before the Thalmor well and truly became the official rulers of the Somerset Isles, it already became very difficult to speak out against the Thalmor, as before their official coming to power, they already targeted those who opposed them by setting their many supporters on them in, threatening ways and turning public opinion on them. So even before the Thalmor came to power, one already had to be careful of what they said in public about them, as especially if your negativity about them gained traction among the population, you could easily be forced into exile, and once you're on a boat to leave the Isles, die a mysterious death. This actually seems to have happened to one of their most famous opponents during their rise, a popular and wise mage in the Somerset Isles, Rhinandor the Bold, who first saw his reputation tarnished by the Thalmor, then saw himself officially be denounced by the Thalmor, and then forced into exile only to never reach his destination, as he was apparently murdered on board of his ship. Now, eventually in the year 22 of the 4th era, the Thalmor gained enough influence in the Somerset Isles and sway over the population that they officially enacted a coup against the kings and queens of the Isles, quickly replacing them and unifying the different kingdoms of the province under their rule. Once they were split in different kingdoms, and now the Somerset Isles was one country, which they renamed from the Somerset Isles to Alanor. At this point, life in the Somerset Isles for anyone who was not one of the races of elf, or was an elf but spoke out against the Thalmor, instantly seems to have become worse. You see, for years the Thalmor had spoken of their anti-imperial views and their views on elven superiority to the people, and that shifted the public narrative, and once they well and truly came into power, they immediately started to carry out their agenda. According to a high elf in exile who resisted the Thalmor at the time, they immediately started the first of many pogroms, so attacks on non-elves, and we know that soon after also those of mixed blood were targeted, as they were considered unclean by the Thalmor. Those who lived on the Isles also seem to have immediately noticed an increase of control and surveillance over stuff like their savings and money, as one elf who resisted the Thalmor recounts that he had to be really careful with withdrawing his inheritance to not seem suspicious to the Thalmor. At this time, in the 20 years directly after their coming to power, there seems to have been a mass exodus from the Somerset Isles, as a stream of refugees seems to have come to the mainland of Tamriel around this time, with even many high elves who spoke out against or resisted the Thalmor being among this stream of refugees that wanted to get out of the Isles as quickly as possible. However, even abroad, those who spoke out against the Thalmor found no peace, as we have different examples from the early 20s to late 40s of the 4th era of Thalmor agents trying to kill those who left the Somerset Isles as refugees or political asylum seekers, with apparently the highlight being the so-called Night of Green Fire, when Thalmor agents targeted the refugee quarter of Sentinel, a city in Hammerfell where a lot of refugees from the Somerset Isles had gathered. But even some years later, after this incident in High Rock, there were still many murders of refugees from the Somerset Isles and asylum seekers. Pretty grim stuff, but it doesn't end there, because it seems that the organizations on the Somerset Isles had a choice at this point, either bend the knee or be targeted. The Sigic Order chose not to give in to the Thalmor, pretty famously actually, and they had their entire island disappeared to not fall into Thalmor hands. And then the Thalmor turned them from a respected organization by the people of Somerset to a sort of national enemy. Meanwhile, the College of Sapiarchs, which we know still exists in the 4th era and is an ancient institution of learning composed of experts in their different fields, seems to have bended the knee to the Thalmor. Now, who also had to bend the knee were the people of Valenwood, because not long after they took power in the Somerset Isles, the Thalmor grabbed power in Valenwood, using a precise set of strikes on the Imperial sympathetic rulers, taking them out, and then invading the province with their armies from the south, leaving the Imperial legions in the province completely unprepared and surprised. And as the Thalmor took power in Valenwood, life for many of the Bosmer also seems to have taken a serious downturn, as there are apparently many quiet purges among the population of those who resist the annexation by the Thalmor. And the Elder Scrolls Cookbook also implies that the Thalmor forced some villages to move or completely empty out, which were too close to the Imperial borders, because they wanted to sort of cut off contact with the Empire for a while. Rebelling is actually extremely dangerous in Valenwood, as those who do get in unfortunate accidents or find themselves a target of a purge. Now, it's at this time when society under the Thalmor really started to take shape, as they broke off contact with the Empire and started a sort of silent Cold War, where the Thalmor seems to have consolidated their power further, tried to undermine the Empire, and tried to get rid of the final few public enemies they had domestically, with people in the Imperial government even speculating that at this time there may have been a sort of organized resistance or other type of power struggle in the Aldmeri Dominion at the time. However, we know that the pogroms and purges continued, and that it was likely at this time, after many of the non-elves had already been killed and driven out as refugees, that the borders of the Somerset Isles were officially closed to foreigners for the first time in centuries. And it's inside the borders where a rigid caste system seems to have been put in place. From several dialogues in the game, we can glimpse that those who are the true members of the Thalmor, to no one's surprise, are firmly on top in the social hierarchy, with it being suggested that even among elves, and even among the high elves, you know, those people who the Thalmor see as the bestest of elves, the most superior of the superior, even among them it's considered an honor to be able to serve the Thalmor, meaning that socially, high elves who are not members of the Thalmor are a step below members of the Thalmor in their society. Now, we don't know the exact status of the Bosmer, but we do see Thalmor officials looking down on Bosmer, and Bosmer primarily in servant roles, so I would think that they are firmly below the high elves in the social order. And while we know from Thalmor agent dialogue that every other race, maybe with the exception of the Dunmer, but we don't know exactly about that, are simply seen as lesser people to be enslaved. Yeah, really like the Ayleid Empire. Side note, we do know that some Thalmor highly respect the Ayleid Empire, which I always found funny. Anyway, that doesn't mean that as a high elf you are safe from Thalmor oppression, as it just means that instead of being killed for rebelling or killed for doing something wrong, you are likely sent to be re-educated, as one note by Thalmor ambassador Elven mentions in Skyrim. Oh, and even having association with known traitors can lead to unfortunate accidents that you may die from what it seems. All pretty grim. And yet, it seemingly hasn't stopped life from continuing under their rule, just with far less political freedom than before, and as long as you are a high elf or a bosmer, preferably a high elf for the social standing, it seems that you can lead a pretty happy life. I mean, even under the Thalmor system, people just live their lives. Kids are born, laundry gets done, get-togethers happen. Life goes on, and the Thalmor even seem to support independent researchers into history and provide them with protection, which is actually pretty interesting, as there must be more examples like that, we just don't know of them, as news from the Somerset Isles is few and far between. And collecting all of this which we mentioned and which I'm about to mention took a lot of time sifting through really obscure references. Now, that being said, Aldmeri Dominion society does seem to have taken a hit since the Great War. Like I said, not only does the cookbook describe quite a lot of orphans, meaning that a lot of the working age people have likely died during the Great War, we also know that for the first time in a long while they actually reopened their borders, at least to Khajiit and Orcs, but the book describes opens to non-Altmer, so it could literally be anyone, even if you're human. Now, I did wonder for a while why the Thalmor would do that. I mean, we've recounted their history and how life changed under their rule, and they don't seem the people to, you know, let people back in if you've just purged the islands, if they want to keep their beautiful isles free from foreign intervention. And the answer may actually lie in the orphans that I mentioned earlier. You know, with so many people disappearing from your workforce due to the war, it's likely, although a theory, so take it with a grain of salt, that the Thalmor have been more or less forced to reopen the borders in order to have foreign workers to keep their economy functioning. In fact, we can read that to many in the Isles, although not to all, there are a lot of high elves who are unhappy with the reopening of the borders, and there are still strong feelings against the now open borders. And it's even implied that some may be afraid to talk to foreigners out of fear of getting in trouble, or just don't want to talk to foreigners because they've been so indoctrinated by the Thalmor. So the situation should be pretty dire for the Thalmor to be wanting to open the borders again to unclean outsiders, as they would call them. Now, I may have read too much into this, but it seemed like a logical conclusion to me, but it may just all be offhand mentions which I just pieced together like an hallucinating AI, but it seemed logical to me. As reopening borders and having your own people be, you know, not very happy with that for the Thalmor seemed like a less than ideal situation, so things must be going less well than they would want. So, what's life actually like under the Thalmor? Well, like I said earlier, life goes on, just with less political freedom. And you could even say that the amount of political freedom may not even have changed as much, as we know that the Septim Empire had to actually do a lot of work to keep anti-imperial sentiments in check, as apparently the Somerset Isles had always, especially in the Septim days, been a bit of a weaker place for imperial support, especially among the population who still remembered the conquest of Tiber Septim and how he killed a lot of Altmer. Because Altmer live a longer life than humans, so some of them still remember the start of the Septim days. But from the few dialogue and mentions that we have, it does seem that political repression has increased under the Thalmor, and social control is apparently a lot greater. Although I suspect that the future Elder Scrolls 6 we will probably get more lore on it there. Anyway, that's basically all that we know about life under the Thalmor, but I do have two little footnotes. Footnote 1, I didn't talk about elsewhere, as they are client states and not directly Thalmor run, meaning that they rule themselves domestically, just not their foreign policy. This means that, as far as we could glean, especially from the cookbook, where there's a few visits to elsewhere, life for the Khajiit seemingly hasn't changed all that much. I mean, yeah, they fall under like foreign rule of the Thalmor, but they still self-rule, so it doesn't seem there is a lot of change that has occurred compared to, for example, the second and third era. And second footnote, I know that I didn't say anything about religion and religious repression, but we don't know about religious repression under the Thalmor. In fact, other than Talos worship being outlawed, probably also domestically among the Thalmor, I mean, why would they outlaw it in the Empire but not outlaw it at home? We know quite nothing about their pantheon. I mean, I even remember one bit of dialogue from a Thalmor in Skyrim saying that they didn't care what god you worshipped as long as it wasn't Talos, as Talos wasn't a god, Talos was a human. But that could have been that guy's own view, so with so little info, I didn't feel justified in speculating about it, so I didn't feel justified in saying, well, that one Thalmor said you can worship whoever you want as long as it's not Talos, so they probably all think that way, we just don't know. So yeah, there may be a lot of religious repression, so I can see it being true that the Imperial Pantheon in general is frowned upon in the Somerset Isles. So for example, worshipping Akatosh instead of Auriel could be frowned upon, but like, when I'm saying that, it's like, yeah, it feels like it would be true, but we don't know, so we really have to wait until further content to say anything about that. And that was about all I had to say for today. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to do your own lore research, I actually sell lore notebooks now. They're in the description of the video in my merch store. And I hope at least that I taught you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today, and if I did, why not give the video a like, as that's how the YouTube algorithm decides, is this content worthy or is it not worthy? And also one of those hype things, I still don't understand what they are, I never see them on any videos where I watch them, but apparently they're useful, so if you want to do that, it would really help me out. Anyway, and now all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters: Goblark, Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Volkure of Argonia, RB Dash, Lexicon, Polycom, Sir Otter, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Mike Willis, Dodo Komodo, James Lynch, Bara Demas, and Kalakranz. These people, along with all the amazing people on screen, are my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members, and they keep this channel alive. And for that, I am very grateful. Alright, see you in the next lore video. Bye bye.